He used to circle the date on the calendar weeks in advance, almost like he was counting down to something important. Now he barely remembers what day it falls on until someone else mentions it first, and he says that like it's a compliment to himself. Nobody thinks that's strange, because on the surface, it just looks like a man quietly getting older and losing interest in small things. But something else is happening underneath that shrug, and it has almost nothing to do with age at all. I started noticing this pattern a while back, in the smallest possible moments, the kind you'd normally scroll right past. A friend mentioning his birthday was next week, I think, with a shrug that felt just a little too rehearsed to be casual. A coworker letting the office cake happen without saying a single word about it, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. An uncle waving off a card like it was an inconvenience rather than a gift someone had actually thought about. At first, I assumed it was humility, or maybe just a mild tiredness with the whole idea of getting older. But the more I watched, the less that explanation actually held together under any real scrutiny. Because these weren't men who disliked attention in general, not even close to it. They laughed loudly at parties, told long stories at dinner, and clearly loved being seen in almost every other setting. Just not on that one day, the day that was supposed to be entirely about them and nothing else. That contradiction is what pulled me in and kept me thinking about it long after the conversations ended. If he genuinely enjoys being noticed, why does he go quiet on the one day designed specifically for noticing him? I kept asking that question in different forms, and the answer wasn't anything close to what I expected. It turns out the birthday isn't really about age at all, no matter how much it looks that way from the outside. It's about being looked at directly, without a task attached, without a role to play, without anything convenient to hide behind. And for a lot of men, that kind of exposure feels unfamiliar in a way they can't quite put into words. You may have seen this yourself in someone close to you, or maybe even in your own reflection some quiet morning. Maybe you've watched a father brush off a celebration like it was somebody else's idea in the first place. Maybe you've done the exact same thing, telling people not to make a fuss and actually meaning every word of it. There's a reason that instinct feels so automatic, so practiced, so easy to reach for without any real thought. From an early age, a lot of boys learn that being the center of attention comes with quiet, unspoken conditions attached. You can be celebrated for winning something, for achieving something, for providing something useful to the people around you, but rarely just for existing, just for having made it through another ordinary year of an ordinary life. So the birthday, which should be the simplest possible celebration, slowly starts to feel confusing instead of comforting. There's no task attached to it, and no performance required to justify all that sudden attention pointed his way. Just him, standing there, being looked at for no reason other than the simple fact of being alive.
And that total absence of a reason is exactly what makes the whole day feel uncomfortable to him. I started noticing how differently he treats other people's birthdays compared to the way he treats his own. He remembers his brother's birthday without needing a single reminder from anyone else in the family. He planned something small and thoughtful for his wife, and he clearly enjoys the planning itself. He'll drive across town for a friend's 40th, bring a gift, make a toast, and mean every word of it sincerely. But when it's finally his turn, he deflects before anyone can even ask what he actually wants that year. That's not modesty, not really, even though it wears modesty like a very convincing disguise. Because giving attention feels safe and familiar to him, while receiving it feels like standing in a spotlight with nowhere left to move. At first, this seems like a small preference, a minor personality quirk, nothing worth examining too closely at all, until you notice how consistent it is across men who otherwise have almost nothing in common with each other. The retired mechanic, the soft-spoken pastor, the guy who quietly coached your kid's soccer team for a full decade. Different backgrounds, different personalities, different lives entirely, and yet somehow the same quiet flinch when the day finally arrives. That tiny recurring detail explains so much more than it first appears to on the surface, because it isn't really about candles or cake or a room full of people singing off-key. It's about what those things actually represent, which is direct, unearned, almost undeserved feeling affection pointed straight at him. And for men raised to associate their worth with usefulness, unearned affection can feel almost unbearable to sit with. Not because they don't want it deep down, but because they were genuinely never taught how to simply receive it. I remember talking to a man in his 60s who told me something that stuck with me for weeks afterward. He said his birthdays stopped mattering the exact year he became a father for the first time. Not because fatherhood erased his need to be celebrated entirely, but because he quietly decided his needs came second from that point on. That decision felt noble to him at the time, almost like a small, private form of maturity. But decades later, that same quiet decision had hardened into something else entirely, something much harder to undo. A belief that his own presence simply wasn't worth marking anymore, not in any real or meaningful way. Without ever realizing it, the small daily sacrifices had slowly become a permanent part of his identity. He wasn't just choosing to skip the celebration for one single year out of practicality. He had convinced himself, quietly and gradually over a very long time, that he no longer deserved one at all. That's where everything really begins changing, at least in the way I eventually came to understand it. Because now, the birthday isn't just an awkward social moment that everyone politely tries to move past. It's a mirror, held up once a year, whether he wants it there or not. And some men would honestly rather not look into that particular mirror at all if given the choice. You've probably noticed how differently people respond to the phrase "happy birthday," depending entirely on who happens to say it. From a coworker passing by the break room, it barely registers as anything more than routine politeness. From a spouse, said quietly without any audience watching, it can suddenly mean everything in the world. That's because the fear was never really about the celebration itself or the size of it. It was about being seen too closely, in a way that couldn't easily be brushed off with a joke. A big party, strangely enough, can actually feel safer than a small, intimate one ever could.
More people means more noise, more distraction, and more places for him to quietly hide inside the crowd. But one person, looking at him directly, saying it like they truly mean it, leaves nowhere left to retreat. That's the exact moment some men quietly dread every single year, even if they never admit it out loud. Little by little, I started connecting all of this to something much bigger than birthdays alone. The same men who deflect birthday attention often deflect ordinary compliments in almost the exact same way. Tell him he did something well, and watch how fast he tries to change the subject entirely. Tell him he looks tired instead, and he'll agree instantly, almost gratefully, like relief has just washed over him. There's a strange, quiet comfort in criticism for men like this, because criticism feels deeply familiar to them. Praise feels like a spotlight suddenly turned on, while criticism feels like coming home to something known. And a birthday, at its core, is really just praise stretched across an entire, unavoidable day. No wonder it feels unbearable to some of them when it finally rolls around each year. Eventually, I started to see the actual shape of what was happening underneath all of this behavior. It wasn't really about vanity or age or even simple humility the way it first appeared to be. It was about a much older belief, planted early in life and quietly reinforced for decades afterward. The belief that being loved has to be earned through usefulness, rather than simply granted through existing. A birthday breaks that unspoken rule completely because nobody actually has to earn getting older each year. You just have to survive another year, and that isn't something most men were ever taught to value. So the day arrives, full of affection, with absolutely no strings attached, and something in him quietly resists it. Not because he doesn't want love, but because he was never really shown how to accept it freely. I think often about the men who grew up in households where affection was carefully rationed out. A pat on the back for good grades, and mostly silence for everything else that happened. Over time, that silence doesn't feel like neglect anymore. It just starts to feel like normal life. And normal becomes very hard to question, especially once an entire life has been quietly built around it. That's why so many men build their identity around what they provide instead of simply who they are. Provider, protector, fixer, problem solver, always something useful attached to the name. All roles that come with a clear evaluation, a clear sense of success, and a clear sense of failure. A birthday offers absolutely none of that structure, and instead, it just offers plain, quiet presence. And presence alone, without any performance attached, can feel unbearably vulnerable to a man who spent decades earning approval instead. You might recognize this in someone who insists they don't need anything every single year without fail. Maybe that person is your father, maybe it's your husband, and maybe, quietly, that person is actually you. That refusal isn't really about material things at all. It's about avoiding one specific moment of being fully seen. Because if you never ask for anything, nobody can watch you receive it a little awkwardly afterward. If you downplay the whole day, nobody notices if the celebration ever falls short of expectations anyway. It's a quiet form of self-protection built so slowly over time that it stopped feeling like a real choice at all. What surprised me most going through all of this wasn't really the pattern itself in the end. It was how much quiet grief was hiding underneath something that looked so small on the surface.
Because underneath the shrug, underneath the "it's just another day," there's often a genuinely quiet ache sitting there. A wish that somebody would push past the deflection anyway and celebrate him regardless of his protests. Not loudly, and not with some big party he never actually asked for in the first place. Just with steady, unmistakable attention that says clearly his presence matters without any conditions attached to it. That's the part that rarely gets said out loud, even by the man actually living through it every year. They'll insist they're completely fine, skipping the celebration entirely, without a second thought. But ask them gently how it felt the one year someone remembered anyway, and watch their whole face change. That reaction alone tells you everything the words were carefully trying to hide from you. By now, the full picture starts coming together almost on its own, without needing much more explanation at all. Every deflected compliment, every dismissed birthday, every quiet "don't make a fuss" over the years, they're not separate habits floating around on their own. They're the same protective instinct wearing different clothing each time. An instinct built to avoid vulnerability by avoiding recognition altogether, wherever it happens to show up. Nothing about this makes him broken in any way, and nothing about it makes him particularly unusual either. It just makes him someone who learned, early and thoroughly, that safety meant staying useful instead of simply being present. And birthdays, more than almost anything else in life, quietly ask him to just be present. No task required, no role to play, and no performance left to hide comfortably behind. Just him, 1 year older, standing quietly in a spotlight he never quite learned how to trust fully. Maybe you've been watching someone like him for years now, without ever fully understanding why he acts this way. Maybe the shrug, the deflection, the "it's really not a big deal" finally makes a little more sense today. Or maybe, somewhere in all of this, you actually recognized yourself sitting right there in the description. Maybe you've spent years turning down the one day designed to celebrate nothing except your own quiet existence. There's no need to fix that overnight, and there's no simple, tidy solution being offered here today. But maybe next time it comes around, the day feels a little less like something to just survive. And maybe, just this once, it feels a little more like something you're finally allowed to receive fully. If today's conversation helped explain why some men quietly disappear from their own celebrations, there's more waiting in this story. Because the same instinct that shrinks away from birthdays often shows up later in how he handles love, loss, and truly being known by another person. The next conversation picks up right there, in the quiet space after the candles are blown out, where the harder feelings usually live undisturbed. It should feel like continuing this exact same thought, not starting something entirely new. Thank you sincerely for sitting with this one all the way through to the very end. If any part of it reminded you of someone you love, or maybe reminded you of yourself, consider giving it a like. It genuinely helps this kind of conversation reach the people who actually need to hear it most. Here's the one question I want to leave you with tonight, and I'd love for you to sit with it. When was the last time you truly let someone celebrate you fully, without quietly deflecting it away somehow? If you enjoy these quieter conversations about the psychology hiding behind ordinary everyday moments, consider subscribing to what comes next. There's always more beneath the surface of things, and I genuinely love to keep exploring it together with you. Thanks so much for being here tonight, and I'll see you in the very next one.